The first thing Rowena Merriweather did when she arrived at the property was press her fingers into one of the gaps between the cabin logs. She felt the wind push back against her from the other side, steady and indifferent, as though the wool itself was breathing against her. She pulled her hand away, looked at the gray sky above the northern Minnesota hills, and said nothing. There was no one to say anything to. That was the end of September 1887. The aspens had already gone yellow, dropping fast 3 weeks ahead of the normal schedule. The old men in Harrow Creek, a town a full day's walk south, had been reading signs since August. Goose bones pale as chalk. Squirrel nests packed twice as thick as usual. The white oak dropping its leaves before the acorns were even ripe. They called what was coming a wolf winter, the kind that did not just kill the weak animals, the kind that killed careful men who thought they had prepared enough. Rowena was 42 years old, and she was not a careful man. She was a widow with $11 a deed to 10 acres of rock and clay, and no intention of explaining herself to anyone. The deed described the property as 10 acres in Cook County, northern Minnesota, surveyed and recorded in 1879. What it did not describe was the reality of those 10 acres, which was this 9 of them, were a steep granite hillside that shed shale each spring like a dog shedding winter coat, and held snow on its upper reaches well into June. The remaining acre was a grudgingly flat piece of ground that sat at the hill's base like an apology, and on that acre sat the cabin, which was also something of an apology, built from unpeeled logs with mud chinking that had dried and cracked over the years, until thin ribbons of outside air moved freely through the walls at almost every joint. Aldous Merriweather had bought it in 1879 for the equivalent of what a swindler in Minneapolis would accept from a man who quoted Thoreau at the closing table. Aldous had been that kind of man. He had read Emerson and believed it. He had read Thoreau and believed that too. He believed that a man with enough inner life could make something real out of raw land through the sheer force of intention and poetry. The land had not read Thoreau, and it did not share his beliefs. 3 years of trying, 3 years of watching the soil resist every seed, watching the hillside deliver rock instead of anything plantable, watching the single flat acre refuse to drain properly in spring so that the ground stayed soft and useless, well into planting season. Then the fever came in the spring of 1884. The quick, violent kind that moves through a body like fire through dry grass, and Aldous was gone in 11 days. The creditors arrived while the ground above his grave was still dark with moisture. They were not cruel men, just efficient ones. They took the furniture and the good china and the 200 books, Aldous's most beloved possessions, stacking them into wagons with the practiced speed of men who did this regularly and felt nothing particular about it. When they were done, they handed Rowena the deed to the 10 acres because it was the one thing they had assessed and found worth less than the trouble of taking it. She had come to the property not to begin again. She was 42, not 22, and she understood the difference. She had come because the town of Duluth, where she had spent the 8 weeks since Aldous died receiving condolences and watching the pity in people's eyes curdle slowly into something closer to curiosity, had become unbearable. She had come because the land was hers in the most unambiguous possible sense, the only thing in the world that was entirely and indisputably hers, even if what she owned was 9 acres of useless granite and 1 acre of mud. She spent the first week assessing the cabin the way a doctor assesses a patient who has been ill for a long, looking not for signs of health but for the precise nature and extent of the damage. The roof held mostly. The floor was solid pine rough but sound. The single window on the south wall still had its glass, a small miracle. The stone foundation, which Rowena walked around 3 times on her hands and knees, was well laid. Whoever had done it knew what they were doing with stone, and it showed no signs of shifting. The walls were the problem, not the structure of them, but the gaps. She spent 3 days stuffing them with moss and dried clay. She dug from the creek bank 50 yards east of the cabin. Every morning she would work until her fingers ached, pressing the material into every crack and seam she could find, and every evening the wind would demonstrate the inadequacy of her work by finding new pathways she had not sealed yet. It was the kind of problem that had no solution, only management, and the management was endless. On the 6th day, she stood before the woodpile stacked against the north wall of the cabin and counted what was there. She was a woman who had been educated at a girls' school in Providence, Rhode Island, where she had learned mathematics alongside literature and needlework, and the mathematics had always come most naturally to her. She counted the wood and then she did the arithmetic in her head, and when she was finished, she did it again because the first answer had not been acceptable. The woodpile would last if she was careful until approximately the 15th of February. The wolf winters in northern Minnesota ran through the end of March at minimum, often into April. She was short by 45 days worth of fuel, and she had $11, which was not enough to purchase 45 days worth of wood from anyone in Harrow Creek, even if she had been willing to make the day-long walk to ask. She stood in front of the wood pile for a long time without moving the wind, working at the back of her neck with its cold, insistent fingers, and she did not make any decisions yet because she did not have enough information to make them. She was a woman who had always needed information before she could decide. Aldous had called it option. She had always thought of it as respect for the actual shape of a problem before attempting to solve it. It was while she was standing there that she noticed the toolbox in the lean-to on the east side of the cabin, half hidden under a piece of rotted canvas she had meant to clear away. Aldous' tools, which the creditors had somehow overlooked, were still inside, and underneath the tools, at the very bottom of the box, was a small leather-bound notebook she had never seen before. She carried it inside and set it on the windowsill without opening it. There were other things that required attention first. Barnabas Merriweather arrived on the last day of September, and he did not come alone. Rowena heard the wagon before she saw it, the particular sound of a well-maintained rig being driven by a man who knew how to handle horses on rough ground, controlled and deliberate. She was outside working on the roof, pressing new mud into a gap near the chimney, and she stayed where she was on the ladder as the wagon came around the tree line and into the clearing. Barnabas was Aldous' younger brother by 3 years, which made him 48, and the two men had shared almost nothing beyond their parents' blood. Where Aldous had been lean and restless and prone to quoting dead writers at dinner, Barnabas was built close to the earth, wide through the shoulder, heavy-handed, a man whose silences were not the silences of thought, but the silences of someone who had already decided and was waiting for the other party to catch up. He farmed 200 acres south of Harrow Creek, and he farmed them well, which he considered evidence of a particular kind of correctness. Beside him on the wagon seat sat a man Rowena did not recognize, wearing a dark vest and carrying a leather satchel across his knees. This man looked at the cabin and the hillside with the expression of someone performing a professional assessment, which was exactly what he was doing. In the wagon bed behind them, sitting quietly with her hands folded in her lap, was Rosalind Merriweather, Barnabas's wife. 44 years old, dark-haired, still and watchful in the way of someone who had learned long ago that watching was more useful than speaking in most of the situations she found herself in. Barnabas got down from the wagon without rushing. He looked at the property the way he always looked at land, starting at the ground and working upward, reading it. His gaze moved across the flat acre, up the granite hillside, back down to the cabin, and settled finally on Rowena on the ladder. His face did not change. "Come down from there," he said, not unkindly, the way you would say it to a child. Rowena finished pressing the mud into the gap she was working on, wiped her hands on her apron, and came down the ladder at her own pace. The man with the satchel introduced himself as Crawford, an attorney from Duluth. He had a pleasant face in the careful, neutral manner of a man whose profession required him to deliver uncomfortable information without appearing to enjoy it. Barnabas made the offer without preamble, $50 for the mineral rights to the granite on the hillside. He said it the way men like Barnabas said things they had decided were fair, which was without any particular warmth, but also without cruelty. He had decided the offer was fair. The delivery reflected that conclusion and nothing else. No, Rowena said. Barnabas looked at her steadily. He had expected this. He had prepared for it. Rowena, you cannot live here. This place will kill you before March. You know that. I know the winter is coming, she said. I do not know that it will kill me. Crawford opened his satchel. He produced a document, thin and formal looking, and held it in a way that allowed Rowena to see it was official without being close enough to read it. He explained what it was in the measured tone of a man who had explained similar things many times. There was a question, he said, about the validity of the signature on the property transfer. Aldous had signed the original deed over to Rowena's sole name in the winter, before he died at a time when his illness had already progressed considerably. Under Minnesota law, a signature executed during a period of demonstrated cognitive impairment could be subject to legal challenge. This was not a certainty, Crawford was careful to say, but it was a possibility, one that might take some time to resolve in the courts. The wind moved through the clearing. Somewhere up on the hillside, a loose piece of shale scraped across the granite face and clattered down into the brush. Rowena looked at Crawford and then at Barnabas. She felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the temperature, not fear exactly, more like the recognition of the full size of what she was facing, which she had understood in abstract but was only now seeing clearly in its specific dimensions. How long would the legal process take? She asked Crawford. 6 months at minimum, possibly a year. And during that time, Rowena said I would remain in possession. Crawford glanced at Barnabas. That is generally how it works, yes. Then file whatever you like, she said. I will be here when it is resolved. Barnabas's jaw tightened. He had not expected that response. He looked at her for a long moment with something working behind his eyes that she could not quite read. The offer drops $10 every week starting today, he said at last. It was not what he had planned to say. She could tell from the slight roughness in his voice that he was improvising, which was not something Barnabas Merriweather did comfortably. He turned back toward the wagon. Crawford returned the document to his satchel with the practiced efficiency of a man whose work here was not yet finished, but was finished for today. It was Rosalind who stopped Rowena from going back to her ladder. She said nothing loud enough for Barnabas to hear. She turned her head and spoke at a volume calibrated precisely for the distance between them, two women in a clearing, while a man walked away, and what she said was this: read Aldous' letter, Rowena, the one in the toolbox. Then she faced forward again, and the wagon moved and the sound of it faded into the tree line. Rowena stood in the clearing until she could not hear the wagon anymore. Then she went to the lean-to and retrieved the small, leather-bound notebook from the bottom of the toolbox, and underneath it, exactly where Rosalind had said it would be, she found a folded piece of paper with her name written on the outside in Aldous' hand. She carried both items inside. She set them on the table and looked at them in the gray afternoon light coming through the south window. The letter she did not open yet. She opened the notebook first because she was a woman who gathered information before she made decisions, and the notebook looked like information. It had belonged to a man named Ezra Cole. She knew that name. Ezra Cole was the man who had sold the property to Aldous in 1879. The transaction that the creditors had later found so easily reversible and the courts might find apparently similarly questionable. Cole had written in a small, precise hand the handwriting of someone who was more comfortable with tools than with pens, but who understood that certain things needed to be recorded. There were observations about the property, about the soil composition on the flat acre, about the drainage patterns in spring. There were notes about the root cellar he had dug into the base of the hillside and why he had stopped. He had hit a layer of hard granite on the left side of the excavation, he wrote, and without better equipment, he could not continue in that direction. But on the right side, going straight into the hill's heart, rather than angling left, the material was clay and shale workable, with a good pickaxe and patience. He had not gone that direction because he had by that point decided to sell the property. His wife would not stay. She said the hill watched the cabin at night. Near the bottom of the last page of notes, Cole had written something that Rowena read twice. He had recorded the temperature inside the root cellar as measured by a small thermometer he kept hung from a nail inside the entrance across 3 consecutive winters. The numbers were specific and consistent. Even when the surface temperature dropped below -30, the temperature inside the cellar just 8 feet into the hillside never fell below 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Not once in 3 winters. He had not explained why. He was a practical man, and he had written down what he observed and left the explanation to whoever might care to find one. The reason is this: deep earth, insulated by its own mass from the surface's temperature, holds a stable thermal baseline year-round. At 8 to 12 feet down the ground, neither freezes in winter nor overheats in summer. It simply holds patient and constant at a temperature that a body can survive without burning through its reserves to stay alive. She set the notebook aside and opened Aldis's letter. It was 2 pages written in Aldis's expansive, unpredictable hand, the letters crowding each other in some places and spread wide apart in others, the way his thoughts had always worked, moving fast and then slowing to examine something small. The early part of the letter was what she expected. Apologies for the land, for the debt, for the dreams that had not turned into the things they were supposed to turn into. Aldous had always apologized well. He had less facility with the actual prevention of the things he was apologizing for, but the apologies themselves were genuine, and she knew it, and it still hurt to read them. Then she came to the part Rosalind had known about, the part that changed the shape of the letter. Aldous wrote that he had bought the property not only because of Thoreau, though Thoreau had certainly been a factor. He had bought it because on the day he walked the land with Ezra Cole before signing anything, he had stepped into the root cellar at the base of the hillside and felt something that he could not explain in the language available to him. He felt warmth, not the warmth of a fire or a body, the warmth of something patient and massive, and entirely unconcerned with the cold raging on the surface 40 feet above. He had stood in the root cellar in the middle of a February afternoon and felt that warmth, and he had bought the land 2 days later. He had never found a way to use what the hill was offering, he wrote. He did not have the right hands for it, or the right knowledge, or perhaps simply the right kind of stubbornness. He wrote that his grandmother, a Scots-Irish woman from Vermont, who had lived to 94 and grown a garden until she was 91, used to say that the earth breathed, that it breathed cold in summer and warm in winter, and that a person who learned to listen for that breath would never be cold. He had always thought she meant it as poetry. Standing in the root cellar that February day, he had believed for a few minutes that she meant it as fact. He asked Rowena to read the notebook in the toolbox if she found it. He asked her to listen for what the hill was trying to tell her. He wrote at the very end that he was sorry he had not been the one to figure it out himself, but that he had always believed she was more capable than either of them had been given reason to discover. Rowena folded the letter and sat with it in her hands for a long time. Outside, the wind worked at the cabin walls with its usual persistence, finding the gaps she had sealed yesterday and testing them, probing for new ones. The light through the south window was going gray and thin. It would be dark in an hour. She put the letter in her coat pocket. She picked up Ezra Cole's notebook and her candle in her coat, and she went outside. The root cellar entrance was half hidden by a tangle of hawthorn that had grown up around the old rotted door frame over the years since Cole had abandoned it. She had seen it when she first walked the property, noted it as something to clear away eventually, and moved on. She pushed through the hawthorn, now the branches scratching at her coat and her hands, and ducked through the low entrance into the darkness beyond. The effect was immediate. The wind stopped. Not gradually, not partially. It stopped completely, as though someone had simply switched it off, and in its place was a silence so total that she could hear her own breathing and nothing else. She stood just inside the entrance and let her eyes adjust and breathed in the air, which was cool and damp and still, the way air is still when it has not been disturbed by anything for a very long time. She lit the candle. The root cellar was small, perhaps 8 feet deep and 6 feet wide. The walls bare earth, reinforced here and there with flat stones that Cole had set into the sides to keep them from crumbling. The ceiling was low, just above her head. The floor was packed dirt, hard and greasy. She moved to the far right wall, the wall that Cole's notes said opened into workable clay and shale rather than granite. She pressed her hand flat against it. Then she moved her hand to the corner where the back wall met the right wall, and she felt it. Not warmth exactly, the absence of cold, a neutrality, a baseline, a temperature that existed entirely outside the war, being fought above her on the surface. She pressed her hand harder into the earth and held it there, and she understood with a certainty that arrived not as a thought, but as a physical recognition. Something felt in the bones of her hand and her wrist and her forearm that Aldous' grandmother had not been speaking in metaphors. She spent an hour in the root cellar with the candle and Ezra Cole's notebook and the blank pages at the back of Aldous' letter, which she had unfolded and smoothed flat. She measured the cellar's dimensions with the length of her arm. She drew a rough map of the hillside above, guessing at the angles and depths from what she had seen when she walked the slope. She read Cole's temperature records again, and then she did the arithmetic the same way she had done the arithmetic about the woodpile, methodically and without sentiment. 8 feet down through workable clay and shale, following the right-hand wall of the existing cellar, deeper into the hill. A room 10 feet by 10 feet ceiling, just high enough to stand in. Connected to the cabin by a horizontal passage running through the 10 feet of earth between the back of the cabin's foundation and the hillside. A small wood stove moved from the cabin into the room with a chimney running up through the earth above and out through the hillside, face anchored against the granite with spikes. The cabin itself sealed and used as a buffer, a dead air space between the surface cold and the underground room. She sat on the floor of the root cellar with her back against the right-hand wall and the candle burning low on the dirt in front of her, and the letter in the notebook open on her knees, and she understood what needed to be done with a clarity that surprised her. Not because the plan was complicated, but because it was so obvious that it seemed impossible no one had done it this way before. It did not matter. She knew it now. The next morning, she rose before dawn, packed her remaining money into her coat pocket, and walked to Harrow Creek. The walk was 8 miles on a road that was more intention than fact in the northern section, a rutted track through second-growth birch and aspen that the logging companies had cut over 20 years before and not much bothered with since. She made it in a little under 3 hours, arriving at Cyrus Caldwell's general store, just as Caldwell was unlocking the front door. Cyrus Caldwell was 60 years old, and he had been operating that store for 32 of them, long enough to have developed an extensive taxonomy of customers based on what they came in to buy and how they look when they asked for it. He was a man of medium height and considerable solidity, with a face that had been weathered by decades of Minnesota winters into something that resembled the bark of an old oak gray, and deeply lined and not unpleasant to look at if you understood that the texture was evidence of endurance rather than neglect. He looked at Rowena Merriweather the way he looked at all customers who came in before the stove had fully warmed up, which was with a careful professional neutrality that could pivot quickly in either direction depending on what they said next. She gave him her list: a new pickaxe head heavy gauge, 2 shovels, one short-handled and one long, a box of thick tallow candles, the kind that burn slow, 2 spools of heavy jute twine, a mallet, a box of common cut nails. Cyrus read the list twice. He looked up at her. He did not say what the 3 men sitting near the stove behind her said, which was various versions of the observation that it was a poor time of year to be starting any kind of excavation project, offered in the particular tone of men who felt that other people's decisions about their own lives were fair game for public commentary as long as those other people were women doing something unfamiliar. What Cyrus said was, "You are working on the root cellar." It was not quite a question. "Improving it," Rowena said. He looked at her for another moment, and then he began pulling items from the shelves with the efficient, unhurried movements of a man who had been doing this long enough that his body knew where everything was without consulting his eyes. When he had assembled everything on her list and was wrapping the smaller items in brown paper, he reached under the counter and produced a small notebook thinner than Ezra Cole's with a plain cover. He set it on top of the wrapped package without comment. She picked it up and opened it. It was written in Cyrus's hand, the handwriting of a man more comfortable with numbers than narrative, precise and economical. There were sketches of stone wall construction techniques, side views, showing how flat stones should be angled and overlapped to create structural integrity without mortar. There were notes about how to shore a tunnel ceiling using timber or flat stone. There were observations about soil types and how they behaved when excavated, which kinds tended to crumble and which held their shape. She looked up at him. "Ezra Cole was a friend of my father's," Cyrus said quietly. He did not look at her. He was tying the twine around the package. "I know what he was trying to do with that hillside. I know why he stopped." He pushed the package across the counter toward her. He stopped too soon. Rowena paid for her supplies. She was putting them into her canvas bag when the store's back door, which led to the storage room and the living quarters above, opened partially and a boy looked through the gap. He was perhaps 16, lean and long-limbed, with his father's coloring and a directness in his eyes that was also his father's. He looked at Rowena and then at the pile of tools she was loading into her bag, and he said, "I know that root cellar. I used to play in it when I was little." He paused. "It goes back further than people think." Cyrus said his name in a tone that was neither sharp nor gentle, simply informational, a reminder that a door had been opened that had not been opened with permission. The boy Prescott looked at his father for a moment and then back at Rowena. "Just saying," he said, and closed the door. Rowena finished loading her bag, said goodbye to Cyrus, and walked out into the cold morning. She was almost to the edge of town when she heard someone call her name. She turned. Prescott Caldwell was jogging up the road toward her, his coat half-buttoned, no hat. He stopped a few feet away. "That cellar," he said. He was slightly out of breath. "The right wall in the back. There is a crack in the granite there, about this wide." He held his fingers 4 inches apart. "When I was a kid, I used to put my hand in it. It was always warm inside, even in winter." She looked at him. "You told your father that—" "He knew," Prescott said. "He is the one who told me about it." He turned and jogged back toward the store. Rowena watched him go. then turned and started the long walk back to the cabin. The bag of tools was heavy on her shoulder, heavy in the particular satisfying way of objects that have a clear purpose, and the road ahead of her was cold and long, and the wolf winter was somewhere up in Canada, working itself into a fury that would take weeks more to arrive, and she had work to do, too. That evening, she sat at the cabin table with Aldous' letter open before her and wrote on the blank back of the last page in the space below where she had drawn her first rough map of the planned excavation. She wrote two things. She wrote 8 to 12 feet down constant temperature clay and shale on the right side workable. Then she wrote in different handwriting than the first, which was the careful, precise script of a woman doing mathematics 45 days short of fuel. Enough stone within 10 feet of the surface to line a room and a passage. Enough clay to make simple mortar if needed. 1 pickaxe, 2 shovels, 48 candles jute twine for measuring, and the knowledge in 2 notebooks written by 2 men who had seen the answer and stopped before they reached it. She folded the letter, put it in her coat pocket, went to bed. In the morning in the dark before dawn, she took the pickaxe out to the root cellar, ducked through the low entrance, moved to the right-hand wall in the back corner, and swung. The shock of it ran up her arms from wrist to shoulder in a single cold jolt. The blade bit into the clay wall and stuck. She worked it loose, repositioned her feet, and swung again. The sound of it was solid and percussive in the enclosed space. Nothing like the hollow ring of metal on stone, more like a conversation between 2 heavy things, and the clay came away in pieces that fell to the floor with a sound like consequence. She swung again, and again, and again. Outside, the wind moved through the aspens at the edge of the clearing, working at the leaves that were still left, taking them one by one. Inside the hillside, 8 feet down in the earth, there was only the rhythm of the pickaxe and the small, steady flame of the candle and the slow accumulation of broken clay at her feet and the faint, barely perceptible warmth of the rock behind the wall she was opening, patient, as it had always been, waiting for someone to come far enough in to find it. On the 15th day, Rowena stopped digging, not because she was finished, not because she was tired, though she was tired in a way that had moved past ordinary exhaustion into something structural, a fatigue that lived in her joints, in the small muscles of her hands, the way cold lived in old wood, deep and persistent and not easily driven out. She stopped because she needed to measure what she had done, and the measurement was not going to be kind. And she had decided that unkind measurements were still better than no measurements at all. She used the jute twine, running it along the walls of the expanded cellar, marking each 6 inches of progress with a small knot the way a sailor marks a depth line. Then she did the arithmetic. In 15 days of working from first light until the candle guttered, she had excavated 42 cubic feet of material from the right side of the hillside, hauling each load out in a repurposed wooden bucket, 1 heavy trip at a time, dumping it in the growing pile behind the cabin, where it would freeze solid within a week and stay that way until April. She needed approximately 300 cubic feet total. Room passage in the breach through the cabin's back foundation wall that would connect them. She had 42 in 15 days. She sat on the floor of the excavation with the twine coiled in her lap and looked at what 42 cubic feet looked like, which was a space about the size of a generous wardrobe. And she looked at the wall of clay and shale in front of her that represented the remaining 258. And she did not let herself feel anything about the gap between those 2 numbers for a full minute, because she needed to think clearly, and feeling things made thinking harder. Then she stood up, went outside, pulled the 2 pine planks she had identified earlier from the cabin's interior floor, where they were already partially rotted and contributing nothing to structural integrity anyway, and she built a ramp. Not a complicated one, A channel of 2 planks angled from the floor of the excavation to the rim of the entrance steep enough that a loaded bucket pushed onto it would slide down its own weight to the base where she had positioned the larger canvas to catch the material and make dragging it to the dump pile a single operation instead of 2. She timed herself. Old method 4 minutes per trip. Bucket from excavation floor to dump pile and back. New method 90 seconds. Not because she was stronger or less tired, because the problem had a better solution than the one she had started with, and she had been too busy working to stop and find it. She went back inside and picked up the pickaxe. 9 days later, on a morning when the frost had moved from the outside of the cabin windows to the inside corners, leaving small, crystalline ferns at the edges of the glass, Prescott Caldwell appeared at the entrance to the excavation with a new short-handled shovel over one shoulder and no particular explanation for how he had covered 8 miles on foot before 8 in the morning. "My father said I was not to come here," he said. "He set the shovel against the earthen wall, so I came." Rowena looked at him. He was 16 and he was carrying himself the way young men carry themselves. When they have made a decision, they intend to stand behind, shoulders level, chin slightly up, eyes steady. She recognized it. Aldous had stood that way exactly once in his life, the day he had signed the papers on the 10 acres, and she had loved him for it, even though the decision itself had been wrong. "Do you know how to shore a tunnel ceiling?" she asked. "I dug wells for Mr. Harmon last summer," Prescott said. 3 of them. None of them collapsed. She handed him the pickaxe and went to fetch the second shovel from where she had leaned it against the outside wall of the cabin. They established a rhythm within the first hour without needing to discuss it. Prescott dug, and Rowena loaded and ran the ramp, and when the material in front of him needed sorting, when a stone came out that was flat and suitable for wall work versus one that was just rubble to be disposed of, he called out and she came to look, and together they decided. He was faster than her with the pickaxe by a margin that would have been humbling if she had let it be, but she had stopped caring about being humbled around day 4, somewhere between the second broken blister and the point where her right shoulder had begun sending specific and articulate messages about its unhappiness with the current work arrangement. What mattered was the rate of progress, and with 2 people working, the rate of progress became something she could actually believe in. During a rest at mid-morning while they sat outside in the thin November sun, eating the hard bread she had packed, Prescott told her about Pastor Archibald. He did not tell it as though it were dramatic information. He told it the way he told most things, plainly, and in sequence the way his father had taught him that information ought to be delivered. Archibald had come to Cyrus Caldwell's store 11 days ago, the week after Rowena had been there to buy her supplies. He had come in the evening after the other customers were gone, and he had spoken to Cyrus directly about the matter of the Merriweather widow and what various people in Harrow Creek were beginning to say about her activities on the hillside. The sound of digging hunters passing near the property had reported. Always digging. Metal on stone from dawn to dusk. Archibald had told Cyrus that allowing his son to assist in this project would be understood by the community as an endorsement of behavior that Archibald, as the town's spiritual authority, could not in good conscience support. A woman of Rowena's age and situation, Archibald had said, was the community's responsibility, not its experiment. Cyrus had listened to all of this without interrupting, which was how Cheryl listened to everything. When Archibald finished, Cyrus had thanked him for coming and said he would think on it. Then Cyrus had gone to the storage room and laid out a new short-handled shovel next to Prescott's coat. Prescott took another bite of bread and looked out at the hillside. "He did not say go," he said. "He did not say do not go. He left the shovel there and went upstairs." He paused. "My father does not waste movements. If the shovel was there, it was there for a reason." Rowena looked at the boy beside her and thought about Cyrus Caldwell, standing in his back room in the evening quiet, placing a shovel next to his son's coat without a word. And she felt something move through her that she did not entirely have a name for. It was warmer than gratitude and quieter than love, and it had something to do with the recognition that even in the most isolated circumstances, a person was rarely as alone as the circumstances suggested. Archibald told your father that helping me was bad for the store, she said. Yes, and your father left the shovel anyway. Prescott looked at her. My father thinks Archibald is right about some things and wrong about others, he said. He thinks this is one of the others. They went back inside and picked up their tools. Elmira arrived on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks into November, coming across the 2 miles of open ground from her farm to the east with a cast iron pot of something that steamed when she set it down, and the particular expression of a woman who has decided to do a thing she has been arguing with herself about for some time. She was 55, broad through the shoulders with gray streaking through brown hair. She kept pulled severely back, and she had been widowed in 1873 when her husband Robert had died of a chest infection in February, leaving her with 3 boys under 10 and 160 acres of marginal farmland. She had kept the farm and raised the boys and not asked for anything from anyone that she could not pay for directly, and she held this record with the private ferocity of someone who understood exactly what it had cost. She looked at the excavation entrance. She looked at Prescott Caldwell. She looked at Rowena. You are doing this with the Caldwell boy, she said. Prescott helps when he can, Rowena said. Archibald knows, Elmira said. It was not a warning. It was information delivered flat. Archibald knows, Rowena agreed. Elmira set the pot down on the flat stone Rowena used as a step outside the entrance. She put her hands on her hips and looked at the hillside above, tracing the angle of it with her eyes the way a person traces a thing they are trying to understand. Then she looked at Rowena with the direct, undecorated attention of a woman who had not survived 14 Minnesota winters alone by being sentimental about hard truths. I lost Robert when I was 37, she said. My youngest was 6. I stayed because I had no other choice and because those boys needed ground under them. She stopped. You have a choice. I know, Rowena said. So why are you still here? Rowena thought about it. She thought about the letter in her coat pocket and the warmth of the crack in the granite wall and the arithmetic she had done on the back of Aldous' last page. She thought about the 42 cubic feet she had measured on day 15 and the ramp she had built the next morning. Because I am right about this, she said, and I want to know what that feels like. Elmira looked at her for a long moment. The wind moved across the clearing, bending the dry grass at the edge of the tree line. I will not tell Archibald the Caldwell boy is here, Elmira said finally, but I cannot stand between you and the town if they come asking. I have a reputation that does things for me I cannot afford to have undone. It was not what Rowena had hoped for. It was also, she understood, more than she had any right to expect from a woman she barely knew in a community that had already decided what kind of story she was. She nodded. Elmira picked up the pot and handed it to her. Venison, there is enough for 2. She looked at Prescott. 3 if you are careful with the portions. She walked back across the open ground toward her farm without looking back. That evening, eating venison stew in the cold cabin by the light of a single candle, Prescott said, She is gonna come back. I know, Rowena said. She wants to see if you can do it. I know that too. He was quiet for a moment, then, Can you? Rowena looked at the candle flame. Yes, she said, not because she was certain, because she had decided to be. Barnabas Merriweather came back on the last Friday of November, and this time the dynamic between them had shifted in a way that both of them could feel, but neither immediately named. He came alone. No Crawford, No Rosalind. He pulled his wagon into the clearing in the gray mid-morning and got down and stood looking at the work that had been done, which was now considerable. The growing pile of excavated material behind the cabin. The flat stones sorted and stacked by size near the entrance. The ramp visible just inside the doorway. The careful arrangement of tools outside. He was a man who had built things with his hands, and he was looking at the evidence of someone else building something with theirs, and whatever he thought about the purpose of what he was seeing, he could read the quality of it. He stood looking for longer than he intended to. "You are still here," he said, when Rowena came out of the entrance to meet him. "I am. Crawford says the legal question could go either way." He said it without particular emphasis. The way he said things he wanted her to understand were not threats, just facts. The signature issue is real. He did not invent it. "I know he did not." Rowena folded her arms against the cold. "What do you want, Barnabas?" He looked at her directly, which was something she had noticed about him, that he looked at things directly when he was not entirely sure of himself, as though the directness could compensate for the uncertainty. "I want to know what you think you are doing." "I am building a room," she said, "inside the hillside. I am going to connect it to the cabin with a passage and move the stove into it and live in it through the winter." She watched his face while she said it. She was not watching for ridicule. She was watching for the moment he understood what she meant technically, as someone who had worked with stone and earth and understood what they would and would not do. It came, a small shift behind his eyes, a recalibration. He looked at the hillside and then at the entrance, and then at the pile of excavated clay. "You are using the thermal mass," he said, not a question. "Yes." He was quiet. She could see him working through it the way a person works through a calculation they did not expect to find coming out in someone else's favor. "It will work," he said finally, and the two words cost him something she could see clearly. "I know." The silence between them had a different quality now than the silences of their previous meetings. Those had been the silences of opposition. This one was the silence of two people standing in front of a fact they had reached from different directions. "The offer is $20 now," he said. His voice was flat. He was going through the motions of it because abandoning the position entirely here today, without more time to find a dignified path to do so, was not something he could manage. "No," Rowena said. He looked at the sorted stone pile once more. Then he got back in the wagon. She watched him go, and she noticed that he did not say anything about the spring or about Crawford or about finding her frozen body. He simply left. She went back inside and picked up her tools. It was 10 days later, on a Tuesday in early December, that the tunnel collapsed. Prescott was working the section closest to the cabin, the last stretch, before they would need to breach the cabin foundation to connect the passage. And this section was the most difficult they had encountered. The soil wetter and heavier than anything deeper in the hill, holding moisture from the autumn rains. In a way, the clay further back had not. He had been moving carefully, more carefully than elsewhere, taking smaller bites with the pickaxe, checking the ceiling before each swing the way his well-digging experience had taught him. Rowena was outside on the ramp pulling a loaded canvas of material to the dump pile when she heard it. Not a gradual sound, a single sharp crack followed immediately by the deep percussive thud of earth releasing itself from a position it had been holding under tension, and then Prescott's voice, sharp and controlled, saying her name once. She was back through the entrance in seconds. The tunnel was full of dust, thick enough that the candle in the neck she had carved at shoulder height was just a faint amber smear in the gray. She could see that a section of ceiling, roughly 3 feet long, had come down, and that Prescott was pinned from the hips down in the fallen material. "I am not hurt," he said immediately before she could ask. "My legs are clear. I can feel them, I just cannot move." She assessed the situation in the time it took her to reach him. The collapsed section was between Prescott and the exit. The material that had come down was not rock, which would have been catastrophic, but dense clay, and aggregate heavy but not crushing. More ceiling above the collapse point was showing stress cracks in the candlelight, thin dark lines radiating from the center of the void. She could not dig him out from this side without risking bringing more down. She went back out through the entrance into the cabin and found Aldous' logging saw on the shelf above the door where it had lived for 8 years without being used for anything. She measured the back wall of the cabin from inside counting logs to find the section that corresponded to where the passage would eventually breach, and she began cutting. It was not fast work. The saw was sharp, but the logs were old and hard, and the angle was awkward, working close to the floor where the foundation began. She talked to Prescott while she cut, asking him questions, making him answer, keeping his voice as her signal that he was conscious and breathing. "Tell me about the wells you dug for Harmon," she said. "There were 3 of them," Prescott said through the wall. His voice was steady, which was the only thing that mattered. "First one hit rock at 9 feet. We had to go around it." "How?" "Short it with timber while we angled, then pulled the timber once we were past. And the second one? Sandy soil, kept slipping. We used split log sections like staves, drove them down ahead of the dig." She kept cutting. "And the third? That one was easy, good clay all the way. I did most of that one myself." "How deep?" 31 feet. She cut through the last log and worked the section free, and there was a gap, low and awkward, just enough to get through. She went in on her hands and knees with the saw and began cutting away the compacted material from the cabin side while Prescott worked at it from his side with his hands. And between them, they cleared enough to pull him through in just under 2 hours from the moment of the collapse. He sat in the snow outside the cab, back against the wall, his right arm cradled against his chest, his face pale under the cold. He had been right that his legs were clear. He had not mentioned that one of the ceiling stones, a flat piece of granite about the size of a dinner plate, had come down directly on his forearm before the rest of the material followed. Rowena examined it with her hands. Not broken as far as she could determine, but the bruising was already visible above his coat cuff, deep purple mottling the inside of the wrist. He would not be using that arm for some days. She sat down next to him in the snow. She looked at the hillside, she looked at her hands. "I was moving too fast," she said. It was not a question or an invitation to reassure her. It was an assessment delivered in the same tone she used for all assessments. Prescott did not answer immediately. He reached into his coat with his good arm and produced Cyrus's notebook, which he had been carrying in his inner pocket since the first day he came. He opened it one-handed with some difficulty and found the page he was looking for and held it out to her. His father had drawn 2 diagrams on that page. One showed a tunnel ceiling, shored with timber, the older method. The other showed a ceiling supported by flat stone angled into the walls on both sides, each stone bearing on the ones below it like keystones in a road arch, distributing the load outward rather than letting it concentrate at the center. There were specific notes about the clay soil type that required this method written in Cyrus's economical hand. The section of passage she had been working most recently was exactly that soil type. She had read this page. She remembered reading it. In the pressure of the timeline and the mathematics of how much needed to be done, she had read it and moved on and not stopped to change her method. She took the notebook from Prescott and looked at the diagram for a long time. "Your father knew this section was going to be the problem," she said. "He has dug in this county for 40 years, Prescott said. "He knows where the wet clay runs." She handed the notebook back. "You should go home and rest that arm." "I will tomorrow." Prescott, tomorrow, he said. He was 16 years old and his arm had just been hit by a rock. and he intended to come back tomorrow. And she did not argue with him because she understood that the stubbornness she was looking at was not recklessness. It was the same thing she was working with inside herself, the same refusal to let a setback redefine the size of what was possible. She went to Cyrus's store alone 3 days later. Prescott had stayed home, arms still swollen. Cyrus's orders this time delivered directly and not through implication. The store was quiet in the middle of the afternoon, only one other customer, a farmer named Briggs who bought his tobacco and left without looking at Rowena. Cyrus had what she needed already on the counter when she came in, which meant he had known she was coming, which meant Prescott had told him about the collapse and what it had revealed about her methods. She did not comment on this. She paid for the pipe sections she needed for the stove chimney, the last of the heavy-cut nails and additional candles. When she was nearly done packing her bag, Cyrus set a canvas pouch on the counter. She opened it. Inside were 12 iron spikes, 4 inches long, heavy and blunt-pointed, the kind used for anchoring stonework to rock faces. "Drive those into the granite seams," he said. "Use them as anchors for the keystones in the ceiling. The clay will shift with temperature changes. The stone will not, but it needs something fixed to bear against." She looked at the spikes. She looked at Cyrus. "Prescott will not be coming back," he said. His voice carried no apology and no particular grief, just the fact of it laid out plain. Archibald came to me again. This time he was not talking about community opinion. He was talking about the apprenticeship in Duluth. The man who was going to take Prescott on knows Archibald. They are in the same church. He paused. "I cannot let 3 years of planning for that boy's future come apart over this." "I understand," Rowena said. "I am sorry," Cyrus said. And she believed him completely because it was not the apology of a man who was being polite. It was the apology of a man who had made a choice between two right things and was living with the weight of which one he had set down. She carried the tools and the iron spikes back to the cabin in the gray December afternoon. And that evening, she worked alone in the passage for the first time since Prescott had arrived, driving the spikes into the granite seams with the mallet setting the flat stones against them, testing each one before moving to the next. She worked slowly. She worked according to Cyrus's diagram. She worked until the candle burned down to a stub, and she could not light a new one without stopping work entirely. And when she finally came out of the hillside and stood in the frozen clearing, the stars were out hard and cold and indifferent above the black line of the tree line to the north. She was alone in a way she had not been since the first day she arrived. But the passage was 3 feet longer than it had been this morning, and every stone in it was seated correctly, and none of it was going to fall. The day she broke through was the 17th of December. She was working the last 18 inches of the passage, the section that would connect to the cabin's back foundation when the pickaxe went through into open air, and she felt the change in resistance the way you feel a door give under your hand when the latch finally releases. She worked the gap wider with her hands, pulling clay away in chunks, and then she put the candle through first and looked. The cabin's interior, seen from below and behind, was dim and cold and entirely familiar. The pine floor above the foundation gap, the table legs she could see from this angle, the empty shelf where Aldous' books had been. She crawled through, stood up inside the cabin, and then turned and looked back at the low dark opening she had come through, at the tunnel beyond it, at the darkness at the end of that tunnel where the room waited. She put her hand over her mouth, not to suppress sound, just to hold something in that needed holding for a moment. Then she went and found what was left of the food she had stored in the cabin, ate some of it standing at the table, and went to sleep on the floor near the stove, with her coat over her shoulders because she was too tired to do anything more complicated than that. The next 3 days, she moved the stove. It was the hardest physical work she had done on a project that had contained almost nothing but hard physical work. The cast iron stove weighed more than she did by a significant margin, and moving it required disassembling it into its component parts, each of which was still deeply awkward to handle, and then moving each piece through the low tunnel on a pine board she had shaped into a crude sled, and then reassembling the whole thing in the underground room while working by candlelight in a space just large enough to complete the task if she was systematic about it. She was systematic about it. The chimney pipe came last run upward through a shaft she had chipped through the stone ceiling of the room over the previous week, then out through the hillside face and up the granite slope, each section anchored to the rock with Cyrus's iron spikes. It was ugly work, the pipe running crooked where the rock face was uneven, the joints sealed with fire clay that had gone stiff in the cold and required warming in her hands before it would work properly. From the bottom of the hill, it looked like something a child might build from found materials. From the inside of the room, when she finally lit the first fire and watched the smoke pull cleanly upward and out, it looked like a miracle. The fire was small, 3 pieces of wood each about the length of her forearm. She sat on the floor of the underground room and watched the stove door glow red at its edges, and she felt the air in the room begin to change, not from cold to warm in any dramatic way, but from the particular stationary cold of stone and earth in winter towards something more neutral, more livable, a temperature that a body could exist in without spending all its resources on simple survival. She sat there for a long time. Then she heard something above her at the surface, the soft percussive sound of boots on frozen ground moving toward the cabin. She waited. The sound moved to the cabin door, a knock deliberate and unhurried. She climbed out through the passage through the opening in the cabin foundation and crossed to the door. Elmira stood outside in the December dark with a cast iron pot in both hands and snow on her shoulders, looking at Rowena with an expression that was not quite warmth and not quite vindication, but contained elements of both. "I heard you finished," Elmira said. "News travels fast," Rowena said. "Prescott Caldwell told his father. His father told the man who delivers his flour. That man talks." Rowena stepped aside. Elmira came in. She looked at the cabin interior with its emptied shelves and the opening in the back foundation wall, and the cold that had already begun reasserting itself in the space now that the stove was gone. "Show me," Elmira said. Rowena took the candle and led her through. Elmira stood in the underground room for a long time after they arrived. She looked at the walls Rowena had built, flat stones set in overlapping courses with clay mortar and iron spikes at the load-bearing points. She looked at the stove in the corner, still glowing, the pipe running up through the stone ceiling. She looked at the small niche Rowena had carved into the left wall where a candle sat burning. She reached out and put her palm flat against the right wall, the wall closest to the hillside's heart. She held it there. "Ezra Cole thought this hill was against people," Elmira said. "His wife thought it watched them." She kept her hand on the wall. "It is not against anything." A pause. "It has just been waiting." She set the pot on top of the stove where the warmth was already enough to begin working on whatever was inside. "I will bring potatoes on Wednesday," she said. The way she said it was not an offer. It was a statement of what was going to happen. She stayed for an hour, and when she left, she did not say anything further about Archibald or the town or what people were saying. She simply pulled her coat tighter and walked back out through the tunnel and through the cabin and into the December night. And Rowena stood at the tunnel entrance and listened to the sound of her boots on the frozen ground until it faded. Then she went back in, sat down next to the stove, and looked at the room she had built. Tomorrow she would bring her blankets down, her small supply of food, the 3 books she had managed to keep. She would seal the cabin above more completely, Against the cold pack the window, with rags block the door with whatever material she had. The cabin would become an outer layer, a dead space in this room. This 10 by 10 stone and earth chamber, 8 feet inside a granite hillside, would become the place she actually lived. Outside, the temperature was dropping. The weather vane on the highest point of Almira's barn, 2 miles east, was spinning northeast. The front that the old men in Harrow Creek had been reading in the geese and the squirrels and the oak leaves since August was massing somewhere north of the Canadian border, building itself into the kind of thing that came through this country every generation or so, the kind they would be talking about for the next 40 years. It was 8 days away. Rowena did not know that yet, but she knew the room was done and the stove was working and the chimney was drawing clean, and she had 8 days worth of food and considerably more than 8 days worth of firewood stacked along the north wall of the underground room, cut small and stacked tight the way Cyrus's notebook specified for enclosed stove work. She was not ready for what was coming because no one could be fully ready for what was coming. But she was ready in every way that could be prepared for, and that was a different thing from the readiness that Barnabas Merriweather, at this exact moment, was believing he had achieved in his large stone farmhouse 2 miles south, with his deep wood pile and his thick walls and his absolute confidence in the approach he had always used. She put 2 more pieces of wood in the stove, watched the glow intensify, and opened the first of her 3 books. Part 3, The Storm and the Truth. The solstice arrived on a Thursday, and the storm arrived with it. Rowena had spent the 8 days since finishing the room in a state of steady, methodical preparation that had nothing frantic in it. She was not racing the weather. The room was done. The stove worked. She was simply closing the distance between what she had built and what she would need, one task at a time each morning until the light went. She moved her blankets down first, then the food stores, then the 3 books, then the small flat stone she had found in the deepest part of the excavation, the one with the shape that seemed to belong somewhere specific. She set it on the narrow ledge she had carved into the left wall of the room at roughly eye level when she was seated, and it stayed there the way things stay when they have found the right place. She sealed the cabin from the inside with the thoroughness of someone who understood that the cabin was no longer her home, but her armor's outer layer. Rags packed into the window frame. The door sealed at its base with a strip of canvas she had soaked in clay and allowed to dry hard. The foundation breach she had cut when rescuing Prescott, she sealed now with fitted stones from the outside surface, leaving only the tunnel entrance itself open, and that she covered with a heavy wool blanket hung from a nail. Just inside the passage, a thermal break between the frozen surface world and the passage below. When she was finished, the cabin above looked abandoned. No smoke from the chimney, no light through the window. The only sign of occupation in the entire clearing was the crooked pipe rising from the hillside face 30 yards away, and on most days a person would have to be looking for it to see it at all. The storm did not announce itself. There was one morning of ordinary December, cold, clear, and still, with the kind of blue sky that northern Minnesota produces in winter, like a final offer before withdrawing all pleasantness indefinitely. Then the following morning, the sky in the north had turned the particular color of old iron, and by noon what had been a wind had become something with intention behind it, driving snow horizontally across the clearing, in sheets that erased the tree line entirely. Rowena was already underground when it hit. She heard it arrive. That was the first thing she noticed, that she heard it rather than felt it. A change in the quality of the silence in the room, a deepening as the surface above absorbed the storm's percussion, and the earth around her took up the sound and muffled it and passed it along in a diminished form until what reached her was less a roar than a pressure, a sense of something enormous happening at a remove. She sat with her book in her lap and listened to it, and found that she could locate the storm accurately in her imagination without experiencing any of its force, directly the way a person reading about a battle in a warm library can understand what is happening without being at risk from it. The temperature in the room without the stove burning held at its baseline. She checked it with the small thermometer she had brought down, the one from the cabin porch, and recorded the reading in the back of Ezra Cole's notebook. She lit the stove and fed it carefully, 2 pieces of wood at a time, watching the temperature in the room climb towards 60 over the course of an hour, and then maintain there with minimal additional fuel. She cooked salt pork and dried beans on the stovetop and ate sitting on the floor with her back against the right wall, the warm wall, and listened to the storm work on the world above her with all the ferocity it had been assembling since August. In Harrow Creek, the storm was a different experience entirely. Pastor Archibald had opened the church doors 2 days before the storm arrived, organizing the community. The way he organized everything through the combined authority of his office and his genuine conviction that the people in his care needed to be gathered and protected. Families came in from the outlying farms, bringing what food they could carry and what blankets they had to spare. The church filled up. Archibald kept 2 stoves burning, and the congregation kept the woodpile fed, and for the first 36 hours, it held well enough. Then the storm deepened. What had been severe became something that had not visited this part of Minnesota in living memory. The temperature outside dropped past -30 and kept going, and the wind drove snow into every imperfection in the church's wooden construction, and the 2 stoves worked continuously, and the wood supply worked downward continuously, and by the end of the second day, Archibald was standing in the back of his church watching his congregation burn the last of the spare furniture and doing the arithmetic he had been avoiding, arriving at the same kind of uncomfortable answer Rowena had done in front of her woodpile in September. At Barnabas Merriweather's farm, 2 miles south of the Merriweather property and 3 miles southwest of town, the situation had been better than the church for the first 2 days and was now considerably worse. Barnabas had prepared the way. Barnabas prepared for everything, which was thoroughly and with attention to the most likely failure points. His woodpile was large. His walls were thick stone laid by his own hands in the first years of the farm. Good work, tight work. His chimney was wood and well-drafted, built to handle Minnesota winters without backing up or clogging. He had not accounted for the wind finding the precise angle that turned his chimney from an asset into a liability. It happened on the second night. A sustained gust from a direction the chimney had not been designed for, driving down the flue instead of drawing from it, filling the main room with smoke in minutes. Barnabas got his family out, and the windows open, and the room cleared, and in the time that took, the cold came through the opened windows and dropped the interior temperature by 20 degrees. And the fire he rebuilt afterward, in a smaller secondary stove in the kitchen, worked hard to compensate and never entirely succeeded. Rosalind moved the children into the kitchen and kept them there, 2 quilts over the youngest, a pot of water always on the small stove. She did not panic. She had lived with Barnabas long enough to understand the shape of a genuine emergency as distinct from a serious inconvenience. And this was a genuine emergency, and she handled it with the focused, practical intelligence she applied to everything she was given room to handle. The main woodpile in the barn was full. The problem was the distance between the barn and the kitchen door, which was 40 yards of open ground, in a wind that had reached 60 miles per hour, and a temperature that was by the third morning approaching -40. Each trip to the barn cost something. Barnabas made the trips himself twice a day, coming back ice-covered and diminished each time, and he watched the wood going into the small stove and the heat bleeding out of the kitchen walls. And he did the mathematics that he had not thought he would ever need to do in this house, in his house, the house he had built with correct materials and sound technique. He thought about Rowena Merriweather. He did not want to think about her. He had been not wanting to think about her since the day he stood in her clearing and looked at the pile of sorted granite stones and felt the recognition move through him that he had been trying to suppress ever since the recognition of craftsmanship of a person who understood what they were doing with materials and was doing it correctly. He had built that recognition into his professional condemnation and driven away and told himself that even well-executed work could be insane in its conception, and he had believed it sufficiently to function for several weeks. He was finding it harder to believe now. Rosalind came and stood beside him at the kitchen window, looking out at the barn through the white opacity of the storm. She had been quiet for 2 days, managing the children and the stove and the dwindling supplies with the competent silence that was her characteristic mode. And Barnabas had been grateful for the silence because the silence left him room to maintain the presentation of control that he understood was part of what his family needed from him right now. She said, "She is fine." He looked at her. "Rowena." Rosalind kept her eyes on the window. "She is fine. I have known it since before the storm started." "You do not know that," Barnabas said. "I know what kind of woman she is." Rosalind paused. "I was that kind of woman. Before." She did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. Barnabas heard everything that lived in the unfinished part of it, all the years of it, and he stood with it in silence for a moment that was longer than most of the silences between them. "The woodpile," he said finally, because that was the problem he could address. "I know," Rosalind said. "Go." He bundled himself in everything he owned that could be layered and went out into the storm. He had intended to go to the barn. He found once outside that his feet were not taking him there. There was no dramatic internal moment of decision, no resolution or revelation. His body simply moved in the direction it had apparently decided on while the rest of him had been standing at the kitchen window, and after 20 yards in the wrong direction from the barn, he stopped fighting it and adjusted his course and put his head down against the wind and walked. The distance from his farm to Rowena's property was half a mile under normal conditions. Under these conditions, it was a different kind of distance measured not in feet, but in the rate at which the body's heat budget depleted against the withdrawal being made on it by the cold. He kept his arms tight against his sides and his chin down and moved without stopping, because stopping was the option that ended conversations permanently. It took him close to 2 hours. He came into Rowena's clearing and saw what he had half expected to see and half dreaded seeing, which was a cabin that appeared to have been abandoned, or worse. The structure was almost completely buried, only the peak of the roof visible above the drifted snow. No smoke from the chimney, no light in the window, no sign that any living thing had been inside it recently or intended to return. Something moved through Barnabas that he did not immediately name. It felt like being wrong in a way that could not be appealed or revised or reconsidered, a wrongness with physical weight. He moved toward the cabin anyway. He began digging at the snow over what he remembered as the door, his hands nearly useless inside his frozen gloves. And he had been at it for 3 or 4 minutes when he saw at the far edge of his vision the thing that changed everything. It rose from the hillside face 30 yards away, a pipe crooked and rough anchored to the rock, and from its open top a thread of heat shimmer so faint it was nearly invisible in the driving snow. Present only as a slight distortion in the air above the pipe's mouth, the kind of thing a man sees when he is looking for it and misses when he is not. Barnabas stood in the snow and looked at it. He had been a stonemason in Duluth from 1862 to 1865 before the farm, before Rosalind, before the life he had built around the identity of a man who knew what worked and what did not. He had read Stone and Earth professionally for 3 years, and he had never entirely stopped reading them afterward the way a man who has learned a language continues to hear it in things long after he has stopped speaking it daily. He had stood in Rowena's clearing in November and looked at her sorted stone pile and known immediately in the part of him that was still the stonemason that the person who had sorted those stones understood load and stress and material behavior at a level that was not theoretical. The pipe was ugly. It was also genius. It had been driven into granite using iron spikes at intervals he could estimate from 30 yards, and it was anchored at angles that distributed wind load across multiple points, rather than concentrating it at the base, and it was drawing in a wind that should have been driving it flat against the hillside drawing, because whoever had designed it had understood the chimney's relationship to the prevailing wind pattern and positioned the exit accordingly. He found the tunnel entrance where she had left it accessible, the snow blown clear of it by the hillside shelter effect. He looked at the opening, he got on his knees and went in. The cold stopped. Barnabas had felt many transitions in his life, from inside to outside, from summer to winter, from the warmth of a fire's immediate radiation to the cold 6 feet beyond it. This was not like any of those. This was a different category of thing, a passage from one physical regime to another that happened in the space of 3 feet of horizontal travel as absolute as a wall. He moved forward on his hands and knees. The floor of the tunnel was flat stone, laid tight, no movement under his weight. The walls were flat stone, each course set with a slight backward lean that compressed under load rather than toppling. The ceiling was keystoned, each flat piece bearing on the ones to its sides, the whole system held at its anchor points by iron spikes, driven into the granite seams at intervals of roughly 18 inches. He ran his hand along the ceiling as he moved and felt not one loose piece in the entire passage. Barnabas had built tunnels in Duluth. Not many, but enough to know that what he was moving through had been built by someone who understood what they were doing at a level that went beyond reading a diagram. He looked at the ceiling above the section he had been told about secondhand, where the collapse had happened in early December, and saw where the repair had been made, the slightly different stone color, the denser anchoring the more conservative keystone angle. She had changed her method after the failure. She had changed it correctly. The room opened in front of him. Rowena was in the wooden chair she had brought down from the cabin, a blanket over her lap, a book in her hands, the stove burning quietly in the corner, 2 candles on the stone ledge providing a light that was small and steady and completely sufficient for reading. A pot sat on top of the stove, producing a smell that made Barnabas's frozen stomach contract with sudden involuntary urgency. The flat stone she had placed on the wall ledge caught the candlelight and held it the way old things hold things without display. She looked up at him. Her expression was not surprise. It was the expression of a person who had considered multiple possible developments and was now simply registering which one had arrived. Barnabas could not speak immediately. His jaw and lips had been cold for 2 hours, and the transition to warm air had not yet given them back their full function. He stood in the entrance to the passage and looked at the room, at Rowena, or at the stove, at the woodpile that was larger than what he had left in his own kitchen, and he felt his understanding of the past 4 months reorganize itself around the evidence in front of him, the way a structure settles into its final position, not with drama, but with a series of small, irrevocable adjustments. How, he said, his voice came out rougher than he intended, the consonants imprecise. The hill is warmer than the wind, Rowena said. I just decided to live in the hill. He stayed with those words for a moment. He had come out here expecting to find a body or a woman in crisis, or in his most privately entertained alternative scenario, a frozen cabin that confirmed everything he had believed about the project's fundamental unsoundness. He had found a woman reading a book by candlelight in a room that was warm by any reasonable standard in the middle of the worst storm in 40 years. He sat down on the floor. He did not plan to sit down. His legs made the decision and he accepted it. He sat with his back against the passage entrance and looked at the ceiling. And for a long time he said nothing because there was nothing to say that would not require him to begin in a place he had not yet reached. And he could feel himself moving toward that place the way you move towards something in the dark slowly with your hands out. I worked stone in Duluth, he said eventually. 3 years before the farm. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the ceiling. When I came here in November with Crawford, I saw your stone pile, the sorted granite. He paused. I knew. Knew what? Rowena asked. That you understood the material. He stopped again. I kept going anyway. The fire in the stove shifted the wood settling, and the small sound of it filled the room for a moment. I knew about Aldis's letter, Barnabas said. Rosalind found it before you arrived at the property. She read it and put it back. She told me what it said. He looked at his hands. He wrote that there was something in the hill, that he had not been able to find it. He paused. I thought it was more of Aldis's poetry, more of him seeing something beautiful in a worthless place. He was quiet for a beat. I was wrong about that. Rowena did not respond immediately. She was looking at him with the attention of someone listening for a specific thing. You were not entirely wrong about Aldis, she said. Barnabas looked at her. He was impractical, she said. He bought land. He could not work with money he did not have because a book told him the land was redemptive. Those things are true, she paused. But he saw what was in the hill. He felt it. He just did not have the knowledge to do anything with what he felt. She looked at the right wall, the warm wall. He needed someone who could read a diagram and swing a pickaxe and do the arithmetic about the woodpile. He did not have that person. He had you, Barnabas said. He did not know that, Rowena said. Neither did I. The stove ticked quietly. Outside, at a great remove, the storm moved over the surface of the world. Barnabas told her about the chimney, about Rosalind and the children in the kitchen, about the woodpile in the barn and the distance between the barn and the kitchen door in what was currently outside. He told it plainly without diminishment or embellishment, the way he told things when he had run out of reasons to perform. Rowena stood up. She went to the wood stacked against the north wall and counted what was there. Then she made a decision without deliberation, the way she made decisions when the arithmetic was clear, and she took a bundle of 12 pieces the size her hands could carry in 2 trips and set them near the passage entrance. The oak row on your eastern boundary, she said. You know where it starts. Yes, stay inside it. The trees break the wind enough to move in. It adds a 1/4 mile, but you will make it. Barnabas looked at the wood. He looked at Rowena. He was 48 years old, and he had been the person in every room who knew what was right and what was wrong for long enough that the experience of not being that person had the quality of physical displacement, like standing on a floor that has shifted. I told Crawford to proceed with the legal challenge, he said. 2 months ago, he filed the initial paperwork in Duluth. Rowena looked at him steadily. I will send him a letter when the road's open, Barnabas said. To stop it. He paused. The property is yours. It was always yours. Aldis knew what he was signing. The room was quiet. The storm pressed against the surface 40 feet above them and found nothing to press against. What changed? Rowena asked. Barnabas picked up the bundle of wood. He stood and looked at the room one more time, at the walls and the ceiling and the stove, and the woman who had built all of it with her own hands in 60 days, starting from a rotted root cellar and a pickaxe head. I looked at your stone pile in November, he said, and I kept going because admitting I was wrong about Rowena meant admitting I had been wrong about Aldis for 20 years. He moved toward the passage. A man can stand a lot of cold before he admits that. He bent and went into the passage, and Rowena listened to him move through it, the sound of his progress measured and careful, a stonemason's hands reading what a stonemason's hands had built. Then the sound was gone and the storm took over again, that distant muffled pressure from above, and she was alone. She sat down in her chair. She put her hand in her coat pocket and felt the letter there. Aldous' letter, the one Rosalind had found and read, and replaced the one she had been carrying against her body since September. She did not take it out. She just held it through the fabric of the pocket, the way you hold something you do not need to look at to know is there. She sat like that for a long time, and then she added wood to the stove and opened her book and read until she fell asleep in the chair. The storm broke on the fifth day, not gently. It withdrew the way it had arrived abruptly, leaving behind a silence so complete and so absolute that Rowena, climbing up through the passage and out into the cabin interior for the first time in 4 days, heard her own heartbeat in the stillness. The cabin was brutally cold, the sealed window frosted thick on both surfaces, the floorboards crackling under her weight. She pressed her face to the cold glass and looked out at the clearing. The world was white in geometrically altered familiar shapes replaced by drifted forms that bore only approximate relationships to what had been there before. The cabin itself was buried to its eaves on the north and west sides. The tree line was still there, the black tops of the birches visible above the white, and the hillside above her rose unchanged granite and snow. The chimney pipe still standing still, anchored a small engineering monument to the use of iron spikes in cold climates. She cleared the tunnel entrance from the outside and then walked the perimeter of the property in the knee-deep snow, assessing. No structural damage to anything she had built. The passage entrance was intact. The chimney had held through winds that had peeled roofing off a barn in Harrow Creek and taken down 3 sections of the church steeple. Harrow Creek itself came back to life slowly, the way communities come back after something that has tested them past the comfortable range of their preparation. 2 people had died. An elderly man who had refused to leave his property and whose neighbors had not been able to reach him in time. A young farmhand caught between his employer's barn and the main house during the peak of the storm, who had not made the 60 feet between them. The losses were mourned with the serious quiet of people who understood they could easily have been worse. Barnabas Merriweather's family had come through. He had made it home through the oak row as Rowena had directed, carrying the wood she had given him, and Rosalind had met him at the kitchen door with the expression of a woman who had not allowed herself to consider the alternative and was now only beginning to process what the alternative would have been. He had not told her where he got the wood until the following morning, when the storm was entering its 3rd day, and they were past the worst of it, and Rosalind had listened and said nothing for a moment, and then said, "I know." "I know you know," Barnabas said. "Did you tell her?" Rosalind asked. "About the letter? About Crawford? About the 20 years? "Most of it," Barnabas said. Rosalind nodded. That was enough for now. The rest could wait for spring, when the roads opened and there was room to move between the things that needed saying. Cyrus Caldwell heard the story from Barnabas directly in the first week after the storm, when travel became possible again, and Barnabas made a point of coming into the store rather than sending Rosalind with the supply list. Cyrus listened the way he listened to everything without interruption, and when Barnabas finished, Cyrus said, "She changed the Keystone method after the collapse." He said it not as a question, but as a statement of something he wanted confirmed. "Yes," Barnabas said, "and she did it right." Cyrus nodded. He put the supply list items on the counter and did not say anything further. But when Barnabas paid, Cyrus accepted exactly what was on the bill and did not add the usual winter surcharge for difficult delivery conditions. It was not a gesture that required explanation between 2 men who spoke primarily through the language of practical action. Prescott heard the story from his father a week before he left for Duluth, and he listened to the whole of it sitting on the counter of the store the way he had sat on it since he was 6 years old. When Cyrus finished, Prescott was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The Keystone section. I would have done it the same wrong way she did. I did not know the wet clay needed the denser anchoring until I saw the notebook page." "Neither did Ezra Cole," Cyrus said. "That is why he stopped." Prescott looked at his father. "She did not stop." "No," Cyrus said, "she did not." Prescott left for Duluth in March when the roads were passable with a letter of introduction from Cyrus to the master builder who was taking him on. The master builder read the letter, read the description of the work Prescott had done on the Meriwether Passage, and said that a boy who had done that kind of work in those conditions had already learned the most important thing about construction, which was that the materials requirements took precedence over the builder's convenience. Prescott started the following Monday. He wrote home every 2 weeks. Cyrus kept the letters in the drawer under the register. Pastor Archibald came to the Meriwether property in the last week of March, when the snow was still deep but the temperature had turned, and the melt was beginning the hillside above the cabin, running thin channels of water down through the granite face into the clearing below. He came alone and on foot, having walked the 8 miles from Harrow Creek without announcing his intention to anyone. Rowena was outside when he arrived, clearing the drainage channel she had dug the previous autumn to carry snowmelt away from the tunnel entrance. She saw him coming across the clearing and waited. He was a man of 50, Archibald, and the winter had taken something from him that she could see in his face without being able to name precisely. Not age exactly, more like the specific cost of having prayed loudly over a problem and had the problem's resolution come from a direction that the prayers had not anticipated and could not comfortably absorb. He stood at the edge of the cleared area and looked at the hillside and the chimney pipe and the tunnel entrance, and he looked at all of it for a long time before he said anything. "I owe you an accounting," he said. "You owe me nothing," Rowena said. "I told the town you were a tragedy waiting for a name," Archibald said. "I said it in those words from the pulpit." He stopped. "I was describing my own failure of imagination as though it were prophecy." Rowena leaned on her shovel and looked at him. "I knew what kind of strength it would take to do what you did," Archibald said. "I knew it because I had seen it before in women in my congregation, and I had found reasons not to call it by its right name." He paused. "I called it stubbornness. I called it grief. I called it poor judgment." He was quiet for a moment. "I was wrong." "You organized the town shelter before the storm," Rowena said. "People were warm because of that. People were alive because of firewood you gave to Barnabas Meriwether," Archibald said. "Those are not the same thing." She could have argued the point. She chose not to because it was not entirely wrong, and because Archibald had walked 8 miles in March mud to say it, and that deserved something. "Come and see what I built," she said. She led him through the tunnel into the underground room, and he stood in it the way Elmira had stood in it, running his eyes over the walls and the ceiling and the stove. But what Archibald fixed on for longer than he looked at anything else was the flat stone on the wall ledge, the one Rowena had found at the deepest point of the excavation, the piece of the hill itself brought inside and set in a place that suited it. "My grandmother would have said, 'The earth provided,'" Archibald said. "She would have been right," Rowena said. Archibald looked at her. "I preached from the story of the woman who built her house on rock," he said. The Sunday after the storm, the congregation understood who I meant. "I know," Rowena said. "Elmira told me." Something moved through Archibald's face that was the closest thing to relief she had seen on it. He had wondered apparently whether she had heard and whether it had been enough, and the answer to both was yes. and he received that answer with the gratitude of a man who had not been certain he deserved it. He stayed for an hour drinking the coffee she made on the stove, and when he left, he walked back across the clearing with a slightly different posture than he had arrived, with the posture of a man who has set something down that he had been carrying at an angle that was hurting him. Spring came the way it always came to northern Minnesota, not all at once, but in a negotiation, cold mornings giving up ground, grudgingly to warming afternoons, the snow retreating to the shadow places under the north-facing granite faces and the deep creek banks, and finally to the upper reaches of the hillside, which held its white until the second week of May, and then released it in a week of daily melt that ran down the stone face in broad sheets and pooled in the clearing below. Rowena planted a garden on the south face of the lower hillside where the granite warmed from below and the exposure collected sun from above, and the combination produced something she had not expected: soil that was workable by early April, 3 weeks before the flat acre below could be touched. She grew potatoes and turnips and winter squash, and Elmira came in late April and helped her extend the bed eastward, bringing 2 seed packets from her own stores and the kind of company that did not require continuous conversation to justify its presence. The first farmers came in May. They came not in a group, but individually on separate days, with the particular manner of men who had decided to do something and needed to not appear to have decided to do it in response to a story they had heard. They looked at the tunnel entrance and they looked at the hillside, and they asked in various wordings that amounted to the same question: how it worked and whether it could be done with a different kind of hill, or a different relationship between the cellar and the cabin, or a foundation that was not laid on flat stone. Rowena answered their questions. She showed them what she had built: the wall technique and the ceiling method and the chimney anchoring. She showed them Cyrus's notebook and Ezra Cole's temperature records and her own notes in the back pages, the measurements and the arithmetic that had guided the project from the day she decided to do it. She did not charge them for this. She did not need to. What she had done to the land had made it worth something that she could now afford to be generous with. By midsummer, 2 farms in the county were being modified after the principle she had demonstrated. A third began construction from scratch, with a subterranean chamber designed into it from the foundation up, the first time this had been done intentionally in the county's history. The master builder in Duluth, the one who had taken on Prescott Caldwell, sent her a letter asking for the dimensions and construction sequence of the passage, saying that a client in the northern part of the state had asked for something similar, and he wanted to do it correctly. She wrote back with everything she knew, 7 pages, and included a copy of the relevant pages from Cyrus's notebook with his permission. Barnabas came in June. He came alone on a weekday, and he tied his horse at the fence post Rowena had put in at the edge of the clearing for exactly that purpose, a gesture of practical optimism she had made in April without entirely knowing why. He had a bundle across his saddle that he untied and carried across the clearing with the deliberate attention of a man transporting something breakable. It was stone. 12 pieces of granite, flat and rectangular, cut with precision, each one roughly 16 inches by 10. He had cut them himself, he said, from the outcropping on the eastern boundary of his property over the course of 3 Sundays in May. He had measured the underground room from memory during the one time he had been inside it in December on the floor, while he was finding his way back to being a person who could stand upright. Rowena looked at the stones. She looked at Barnabas. "The floor," he said, "it is packed dirt. It works, but it is cold in the feet in winter. These will hold the stove heat." She carried them down through the passage herself, 1 or 2 at a time, and laid them on the underground room floor over the course of an afternoon, and they fit the dimensions of the room with the precision of pieces cut by a man who had measured from memory because he had been paying attention even when he had been believing he was right. Rosalind came in July and then again in August, and after that she came once a month through the fall and into the following winter, making the trip from the farm in the wagon with the ease of someone who has decided a thing and does not require ongoing justification for the decision. She and Rowena drank coffee and sometimes talked and sometimes did not. And the quality of the silence between them was the kind that accumulates between people who know things about each other that do not need to be said because they are already fully understood. One afternoon in October, the second year, Rosalind brought something wrapped in cloth and set it on Rowena's table without comment. Rowena unwrapped it. It was a book old and thick, and leather covered the pages dense and slightly foxed with age. Emerson's collected essays, not Aldous' copy which the creditors had taken. A different copy newer found where Rosalind had found it without explaining. Rowena held it and looked at Rosalind. "He read that one until the cover came loose," Rosalind said. "He was right about some of what is in it, not all of it, but some." "I know," Rowena said. She put it on the stone ledge in the underground room beside the flat piece of granite she had found at the deepest point of the excavation. It stayed there. The following winter was a hard one, but not a wolf winter, and Rowena moved through it with the confidence of someone who has already been tested at the thing's outer limit and knows what they can carry. She read and she wrote in the notebooks, and she taught the farmers who came with questions, and she tended to the garden that was already in its second year producing more than she could use, and so she gave the surplus to Almira, who gave some of it to the church, which was Archibald's institution, and therefore Archibald's problem to distribute, which he did without attribution and without making a point of it. Cyrus Caldwell's iron spikes, the ones she had left over from the construction, she kept in a canvas bag on the shelf above the tunnel entrance. And when the farmers who came to ask questions needed them for their own projects, she gave them freely. Cyrus replaced her supply without being asked, leaving a new bag on the counter the next time she came to the store, refusing payment with a look that ended the conversation. Prescott sent a letter in December of the second year. He had been given his first independent project, a storage structure for a grain merchant in Duluth, and he had designed it with a partially subterranean foundation chamber that the merchant had initially questioned, and then, upon experiencing his first winter in the completed building, praised extensively. Prescott wrote that he had told the merchant where the idea came from. He wrote that the merchant had said he would like to correspond with Mrs. Merriweather if she was willing. She wrote back to Prescott and said yes. The hill above the cabin was unchanged by any of this. It shed its shale in the spring and held its snow on the upper reaches until June and offered its constant thermal breath to anyone who came far enough in to receive it, the same as it had always done, the same as it would continue to do long after the cabin above it had rotted back to its elements and the clearing grown over. And the memory of the woman who had listened to it passed from living knowledge into the kind of story a region tells about itself to remember what it has survived. But that was later, and there is no need to go there yet. What matters is this: on a Thursday morning in late October of the second year, Rowena Merriweather sat in the underground room with coffee on the stove and Emerson on the ledge and the flat granite stone beside it, and she opened the newest notebook to a blank page and began to write down what she knew about building in cold climates, which was now considerable, and she wrote it in the plain, specific language of someone who wants the information to be useful rather than impressive. And the room was warm around her, the same temperature it had been in September, the same it would be in February, the earth holding its breath steady and deep and patient as it had always been, waiting for the next person who needed to know it was there.